All right, we are now live. So, thanks everyone for being here today and joining us online and spending your afternoon with us. We got a really super interesting lecture today, an interesting story, and we'll get started. So, for those that don't know me, my name is Kira Johnson, and I've been bestowed with the honor of in-house historian for the St. Andrews Society of Colorado. It's kind of a new position that we're trying out, and the goal here is to just bring stories and lectures to members on topics of Scottish history that they might be interested in. So, a little bit about me. I grew up here in Colorado, and my ties to Scotland are very familial. My grandmother was from the Isle of Lewis, and so joining the St. Andrews Society of Colorado really was combining two of my favorite things, Colorado and Scotland. And so I'm excited to be part of it. I recently finished my master's program in Scottish history through the University of Dundee, and I also have a bachelor's degree in history from CU Boulder as well, where I focused a lot on British history and was able to get some Scottish history through there as well. So that's my background and what I like to do. Um, some of my studies focus more on early modern and modern Scottish history, but I really enjoy this period that we're about to talk about as well. Okay, so today we're covering one of the most intriguing, oops, sorry. Today we're covering one of the most intriguing Scottish monarchs in history. This is Mary, Queen of Scots. So, for those that know the Marian story, I hope you learned something new today. And for those that don't, I hope it sparks a renewed interest. It's pretty well known. So, the first thing I like to start with is just a great rendering of what Mary might look like today. I'm not actually going to be able to play the video, um, but I like showcasing some of these things because I think it really humanizes some of those historical characters. It's easy to feel disconnected from these events, but seeing how they might appear today reminds us that they were indeed living, breathing, feeling human beings, and they were facing the struggles of their time. Um, the woman behind royalty now does a really awesome job of doing that. She takes portraits and maybe death masks and creates renderings of what they might look like in modern society. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. So here's a rendering, a half rendering anyway, of what Mary might have looked like in modern society today if she were walking around. So, in describing her cousin, Elizabeth I, and Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, they were indeed cousins. Elizabeth referred to her as the daughter of debate, that discord aye doth sow. It's as true a statement then as it is now. Mary's short personal rule of Scotland really divided the country deeply on religious and political matters, and even now, very few monarchs have sparked such debate amongst historians. So, historians have long wrestled with her reign and the implications of her policies. They've argued and depicted Mary as everything from a steadfast Catholic martyr to maybe an expert politician who's vying for the English crown, or she's just easily persuaded by the shifts in personalities around her as a young, naive queen. And depending on which book you read, you might come away with a different outlook altogether. What we can agree on is that Mary is one of Scotland's most well-known and popular historical figures. She even shows up to our Colorado Scottish gatherings if you've seen her there with her crew and her tent. But her reign was really marred by scandal and tragedy, romanticism, and high political stakes on the world stage. So, who needs Game of Thrones or reality TV when we have this history? Although, to be fair, there's way less dragons in this. But it's really exciting stuff and at times tragic. So, I hope you enjoy this today. Let's dive in. A quick overview of the lecture today. We have lots to cover, so please feel free to take down your questions. We'll get to them afterwards, or feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll address them later. And we can always do a kind of a part two deep dive if needed. There are a lot of things that we could go down and rabbit holes, things to dissect. And so if there's a particular area that maybe later on we go, let's look at that in a little bit more detail, we can certainly do that in a future lecture. So Mary's story is typically divided into three parts. her minority rule, which involves a lot of background information because she's actually mostly growing up in France during this period. Then we move to her personal rule, and this is when she returns to Scotland to physically rule in Scotland. And then lastly, and more tragically, we look at kind of her downfall and her confinement in England. So her 20 years that she spent in England. And this is how we're going to break up the lecture today in these sections. But first, Mary was born on December the 8th, 1542, at Linlithgow Palace, depicted here, about 15 miles west of Edinburgh. And at the time, it was considered one of the principal residences of Scottish monarchs during the 15th and 16th centuries. So right now it's just ruins. You can visit there, but this is where she was born. Mary was born to King James V of Scotland. He was of the Stuart royalty, and her mother was Mary of Guise. Mary was a French noblewoman. She was of the House of Guise, which was one of the most powerful families in France. They had incredible influence in politics and other things regarding the royal household in France. So this marriage really signaled a renewal of something that we called the Auld Alliance between Scotland and France, and Auld spelled A-U-L-D, which goes as far back as 1295 during the first wars of independence in Scotland. And this is a theme that we'll visit throughout this lecture. Scotland and France were pretty intertwined. Sometimes Scotland was in alliance with England, and other times France. It really depended on the politics of the day and what was beneficial for those countries at the time. So, first things first, don't let the slide overwhelm you. Anyone who looks at any monarchical line, especially in Britain, it can get very overwhelming, especially when we start to overlap. So, this is just a helpful visual as we talk about the lineage in Scotland and England. So, what I want to point out here is that we're just talking about James and Mary of Guise, and it's important to note that James, Mary's father, was the son of course, James IV of Scotland, and also Margaret Tudor, which is Henry VIII's sister. So this is important for a couple of reasons. One, this marriage here between James IV and Margaret Tudor really illustrates an Anglo-Scottish union, an alliance there. James V, in his marriage to Mary of Guise, showcases a reversal, and now we have more of a Franco-Scottish union. Marriages at that time were political in nature and signaled some of those things. I've notated the English Tudors by the Tudor Rose here, and then we've got the Stuart line, the Scots, as the lions. And so another thing to note here, which we'll talk about, is this Stuart claim to the English throne, because this is really looking at the English throne here. So right here, the marriage between James IV and Margaret Tudor is what sets up the Stuart line, the Scottish royal family, to have a claim also to the throne of England. So this is something to remember as we work through this lecture. There's a lot of contention and there's a lot of conflict and fear that happens because of this claim that they might have. So James V, he unfortunately dies after an illness, after a defeat by the Scottish army, by the English. And so Mary was his only legitimate offspring. He did have an illegitimate son, who we'll talk about later, but she becomes queen at 6 days old. And ironically, James became king at 17 months old. So Scotland really has a habit of creating little baby royals. And so this is just an important illustration. And we'll come back to this. Again, this is not to overwhelm anybody, but can be helpful when we're looking at the story. So a lot of our story takes place here with Mary and also with Queen Elizabeth. So let's get to the first section here. This is called the minority rule of Mary. And this is because until Mary is of age, Scotland needs to have a regent in her stead. She is a literal baby queen. She can't make any decisions, or at least she shouldn't. And so she needs to have someone making those decisions and running the country. So this section covers that period until Mary returns from France in 1561, and we'll talk about the circumstances around that. So this section is going to feel like a lot of background as we talk about different people, but it is super, super helpful in understanding the issues that Mary is going to face as queen when she returns to Scotland. Because she doesn't just return and everything is all hunky dory. So the first regent was James Hamilton, the Earl of Arran. And he was next in line for the throne of Scotland after Mary. And so he served as governor and protector of Scotland during a very tumultuous period. Before we go any further, too, it's really important that we have a quick refresher on the Protestant Catholic clash that's happening in Britain. This is going to play out a lot in the story. And in really any lecture that you attend dealing with Scottish history, there's probably going to be background regarding um, the move from being a Catholic nation to a Protestant nation. So remember, right now we have a Protestant England, and the Reformation is making its way to Scotland. The Tudors, the English crown, Protestant. And so Protestant Scots often align themselves as pro-English, whereas the Stuarts, they were Catholic and pro-French at this particular time. So the Earl of Arran is interesting because he illustrates some of the flip-flopping that happened with especially nobility as they were vying for their own claim to the Scottish throne. So at first, he was pro-English and Protestant. He championed the betrothal of Mary to Prince Edward of England, and that would renew an English-Scottish union. And they wanted that to happen via a treaty called the Treaty of Greenwich. But then, when that treaty failed, Arran converted to Catholicism in 1543. Likely, he saw the writing on the wall and decided his loyalty need to remain with the rule at the time. So, but his loyalty to anything was tenuous at best. He had his eyes set on the Scottish throne and often worked in self-interest to figure that out. Now there was another family that also had a line to the Scottish throne besides the Hamiltons or the Earls of Arran, and that would be another Stuart family, and they were the Earls of Lennox. And we'll talk about the Lennox Stuarts in a little while. So again, Earl of Arran was regent during something we called the Rough Wooing in conflict with England. So as I mentioned, in 1543, the Treaty of Greenwich, promising the marriage between Mary and Edward, this fails. And the implications of this treaty failing are massive. This means that the Anglo-Scottish alliance collapsed, or what was left of it, and this kicks off the period called the Rough Wooing. What that means is that Henry VIII opted for a more forceful union. So English forces invaded Edinburgh in May of 1544, and thus began a 7 or 8 year period of war with England and Scotland. The name Rough Wooing was such an understatement. But Scotland has a way out. If we remember the old alliance, right? This is France. In exchange for French military support, Scotland promises the betrothal of Mary to the Dauphin of France, which is the Prince of France. This is Prince Francis, who's the son of King Henry II of France. And they proposed the Treaty of Haddington in 1548 to secure this. And this is agreed to by both countries. It was understood that eventually the pair would rule both Scotland and France, potentially making Scotland a province of France. This is a problem for England, right? So the failure of that 1543 betrothal treaty opened up the door for another renewed alliance between Scotland and France. So France comes to the rescue, they intervene in the conflict, and eventually succeed in ending the English occupation in Scotland. The old alliance is strengthened yet again. So just for a visual, the alliance between Scotland and France, as we've talked about, goes as far back as 1295. You'll see instances of them calling on France for help or vice versa throughout history. This is a problem for England on many fronts. France is a strong continental power and one of England's oldest foes. So, just geographically speaking, Scotland is literally a backdoor into England, and France could use that to their advantage, as could Scotland. Excuse me. And two, France is a Catholic kingdom, as is Scotland at this time. So the Protestant Reformation had moved up into Scotland from England, but it hadn't taken a hold yet to the degree that it had in England at this particular time. It was about to, though. So now England has two Catholic powers in alliance. Uh, the Queen of Scotland betrothed to the Prince of France, who would be king someday, and this Catholic queen has a claim to the throne of England. So this is not a good deal for England. So as we're going through all of this, you might be wondering, okay, where is Mary? And Mary is actually in France. When the French landed in Scotland in 1548 to save them from English occupation, they also set up a transport for Mary to go to France and grow up there for her safety. So she was only 5 years old when this happened, and she would spend the next 13 years in the French royal household of Henry II as betrothed to Prince Francis, the Dauphin of France. Also, just as an aside, because I think this is kind of funny, Mary was accompanied by her four childhood companions, Mary Beaton, Mary Seton, Mary Livingston, and Mary Fleming, and they were called the Four Marys, and I just love the visual of just a gaggle of Marys. And you'll see throughout this whole lecture, there are a lot of names that can get confusing. We've got a lot of Marys, we've got a lot of Henrys, we've got a lot of Stuarts, we've got a lot of Jameses, and so I'll do my best throughout this to make sure that it's clear which ones we're talking about. So the four Marys plus Mary, so the five Marys, all go to France, grow up there. So Mary was educated in the royal court under French tutelage. She was brought up in the Catholic faith, and of course, she was learning how to be a royal. It's also here that she grows up alongside her future husband, um, Francis or Francois. And she talks very fondly about her time in France. She really enjoyed it. So here's an image of young Mary, perhaps around the time that she was taken to France, maybe a little bit later. And then we have another image of Francis II and Mary. They were married very young in 1558, and he was still the prince. In 1559, unfortunately, Henry II of France died, so Francis becomes King of France, and Mary becomes the Queen Consort of France. Now, Queen Consort just means essentially she's the wife of the king. Now, let's go back to Scotland. While Mary is in France, there are just a few things happening in Scotland that are important to note. In 1554, so remember we had the Earl of Arran, he was regent. In 1554, he surrendered the regency to Mary's mother, Mary Guise, on the condition that he would be named king if Mary died childless. So Mary Guise then becomes the Queen Regent of Scotland until her death in 1560. So remember, this wasn't necessarily unusual. She had experience in the Scottish royal court when her husband was the king, James V. So she ran the country pretty consistently with previous Stuart policies, which were pro-Catholic and pro-French for the most part. That did not necessarily mesh with the new Protestants. And also remember around the same time, in 1558, Elizabeth I becomes Queen of England, and at the same time, what some historians call the Reformation crisis begins in Scotland around 1559. This is the start of the Scottish Reformation. So again, Guise was French, she was Catholic, so her policies reflected that, but she was actually very conciliatory and very lenient towards Protestants. She was just trying to keep the country stable and calm until her daughter could rule. She was trying to make sure that it would pass on to her in a stable manner. Guise did appoint some Frenchmen to Scottish high office, and garrisons remained in place to maintain security, especially after the war that had just taken place between England and Scotland. So, needless to say, many subjects, especially Protestants, did not like this at all, felt there was too much foreign and Catholic influence in Scotland. Um, Historians debate the degree to which there was actually French domination during this period, but it didn't mesh too well. So, a rebellion starts against Guise. A group of Protestant Scottish nobles banded together with John Knox, who we now consider the father of Scottish Reformation. He was a Protestant minister, and they formed the Lords of the Congregation. They rebel against Guise's rule. By 1560, the Reformation Parliament is established in Scotland. Basically means that Protestants became the majority of the state, and they rammed through legislation that outlawed Catholic practices and established Protestantism as Scotland's religion. So this is all happening while Mary is in France. Mary Guise dies in June of 1560, and sadly, shortly thereafter, Mary's husband, King Francis, dies in December of the same year. So a lot's happening in 1560. This brings us to Mary's personal role. After Francis dies, Mary is more or less ousted by her mother-in-law and the French royal court. And so she returns to Scotland to rule after nearly 13 years in France. At this point, she's 18 years old. She spent far more of her life outside of Scotland than in it, and more years in England, which we'll get to later. But only in Scotland during this period did she truly get to exercise political power. So this is where we move to next. Here's a nice image of Edinburgh Castle. If you have a chance to visit, I highly recommend it. Mary was sad to leave France. I mean, she spent her formative years there. For all intents and purposes, she was French. She went on a lengthy goodbye tour throughout France before she set sail for Scotland. And according to historian John Guy, she said something along the lines of, "Adieu, France. I think I shall never see your shores again." And she was right. She would never go back to France. So, Mary returns to Scotland as an 18-year-old widow. She lands at the port of Leith, just outside Edinburgh, on August 19th, 1561. And there was a decent royal procession to welcome her. Now, remember, she grew up around the French nobility and French royalty, and she was queen consort of France for a time. So the royal lifestyle wasn't new to her, but being in Scotland was a new thing, right? She only lived there till she was about 5. Um, and so the Scotland she returned to had much more internal conflict than when she left. She had a lot waiting for her. Plus, England had a new queen as well, Queen Elizabeth. Mary likened them to sisters. Indeed, they were cousins, and she hoped for an amicable relationship. Elizabeth was much more cautious and saw her reign as vulnerable if Mary were to come for the English crown. Remember, Mary has a legitimate claim as well. And one thing I want to note, because sometimes this is pointed out in media, that they never meet in person. Elizabeth and Mary never meet in person. There's a lot of letters that are written back and forth or communication that's passed through convoys and whatnot, but they actually never meet in person, which I think is really interesting because they both affected each other's lives so much. So Mary has quite the responsibilities when she gets back to Scotland with worldwide implications. She did choose advisors who had experience in Scotland with her mother. Some of them were French, some were not. One of her close advisors was her half brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Moray. This was the illegitimate son of James V. We'll talk about him in more detail soon, but even though he was a Protestant leader and they had religious differences, Mary wanted to have him on as an advisor. And also at this time, the council was primarily Protestant as well. Needless to say, Mary received pushback from the Lords of the Congregation, that Reformation Parliament, her brother, and the minister John Knox. John Knox especially, and I quote, said that the empire of a woman was repugnant to nature and a subversion of good order of all equity and justice. Not to mention, Mary was a Catholic, which is his worst nightmare. That's a nightmare combination for John Knox. As a popular minister, he had great sway in the Protestant community in Edinburgh and with the nobility. So Mary had quite the balancing act when it came to religious policy. She was this new queen, she was a Catholic queen coming in to rule a now Protestant kingdom. So Protestants feared that she would reverse the Reformation and enact a counter Reformation. But their fears were mostly unfounded, especially during her early years. She maintained her mother's largely lenient policies towards religious freedom, and later she would exhibit some shifts in religious policies and alliances. Historians argue whether these shifts were calculated and opportunistic, political in nature, personal conviction, or just symptomatic of an inability to govern. So just maybe being a naive young queen. One historian sees Mary's religious policy of conciliation as political and nothing more than a Scottish solution to a distinctive Scottish problem. In other words, it was appropriate to keep the council and the royal household separate on these matters. Lastly, some see these policies as merely a tool for a much bigger ambition, the English crown. So I think as anyone studies the story of Mary, these questions always pop up around some of her decisions when it comes to religious or political decisions. And we think to ourselves, why did she do that? Was it ambition? Was it because she wasn't sure? And historians just argue back and forth about this to this day. However, I think that one of Mary's speeches that she gave in October 1566 gives us some of the best insight into her religious policy decisions. She says, "Wherefore, above all things, I require you to have charity, concord, and love amongst yourselves." At the end of the day, Mary wanted to attend her Catholic Mass. She did not necessarily care if others preferred a Protestant service. She did not want to instigate a religious war, so she leaned more on an individual liberty of conscience policy for the nobility and her subjects. For all intents and purposes, this policy allowed Mary to continue practicing her personal faith via private Mass, regardless of some of the Protestant legislation that was passed through. This was not acceptable to Knox or to Protestant leaders. Having a Catholic monarch simply would not do. So this contention, as we see, is building, and it's going to continue to build over the coming years. So I want to briefly go back to the scary succession chart, just to orient ourselves as we head into an intense period of Mary's personal reign. So here we are. We're here with Mary, Queen of Scots, and she's back in Scotland during her personal rule. And right now, Elizabeth is queen. Edward had already died and passed away. Mary had already died and passed away. So now it's Elizabeth. Both are unmarried and childless. So Elizabeth and Mary are both like the most eligible bachelorettes of all time. And a bunch of countries and people are proposing right and left. So this is a really pivotal moment within the succession here. Ultimately, Mary ends up marrying Henry Stuart, and again, this is someone from the Stuart line, and he's styled as Lord Darnley, so we're going to call him Darnley for the rest of this lecture. He's actually Mary's half cousin, so he has a claim to the Scottish throne and a claim to the English throne because his grandmother was also Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. So you can see we have Darnley right here. So, although Darnley has Scottish roots, part of the Stuart line, he grew up in England because his father, who was the fourth Earl of Lennox, we'll just call him Lennox, sided with the English during the rough wooing. That period we talked about earlier, that 7 or 8 years of war between England and Scotland after the failure of the Treaty of Greenwich. Um, and Lennox also opposed Mary's mother, Mary Guise, as regent, probably because he felt that he had a better claim to rule. Um, Eventually, he was found guilty of treason and he sought asylum in England for 22 years. So, this is where Darnley was born and grew up. Um, Lennox wasn't readily accepted into the royal court because he was Catholic, right? This is Protestant England. So they returned to Scotland in 1564, which is pretty interesting timing if you think about it, right? We have a queen who is unmarried, who has a legitimate claim to the English throne, and there's an opportunity there for a marriage. And they do get married. Mary was initially charmed by Darnley. This is a pretty young picture or portrait of him, by the way. She was initially charmed by Darnley. However, very shortly into the marriage, real issues started to um, arise. He was unpopular with the nobility. He was considered crass, had an issue with drinking, violence, arrogance, and so it really turned tumultuous between him and Mary, not least in part because he demanded the crown matrimonial, which would elevate him from king consort to king and would make him successor to the throne if Mary were to die. So essentially, what he was asking of Mary is saying, um, make me king if you die, rather than just husband to the queen. Mary refused to grant this to Darnley, and that was probably good foresight on her part. She was starting to not trust him, and they were having issues. This really angered him, and things really started to go sideways. So, if things haven't gotten interesting enough already, they're about to get even more interesting. So, hang on. This marriage was so unpopular that Mary's half brother, who we talked about, James, the Earl of Moray, we'll call him Moray, um, incited a rebellion against his sister. So he banded together with the Protestant leaders and anyone else who had an issue with this marriage and started a rebellion. They cited not only their displeasure with the marriage, but they complained about the governance. They complained about a proposed or alleged plan to reinstate the Catholic religion. Um, they didn't like that Mary employed foreigners at court, including and especially a character named David Rizzio, who is an Italian, and he was Mary's private secretary. And also, they claimed that Darnley was foreign because he grew up and was born in England, even though his family's Scottish. So this resulted in something called the Chaseabout Raid in August of 1565, so not too long after they were married, in which the rebellion and the government forces, they basically armed up and then they just moved back and forth across Scotland without actually fighting. Hence the name, the Chaseabout Raid. At the end of the day, the Queen's forces were much bigger than Maury's forces, and so the rebel lords fled to England. Also, talk about family drama. I mean, this is her half brother. She had him on as an advisor, and there's just a lot going on there. But the implication from this is that unrest from the Protestant nobles continued to brew. We're seeing that. And distrust between the groups grew. Things are starting to become a little unstable, not only in the country, but also in Mary's marriage. But the lords of the congregation, they had to catch her out somehow, and they would get their chance soon. So here come the scandals and the controversy. I need to take a drink. There's a lot going on here. Okay, so this really kicks off with the murder of Rizzio. I just mentioned him, David Rizzio. He was an Italian courtier and the private secretary for Mary. He got to his position by making friends with Mary's musicians. He was said to be a talented musician himself, but they got close. Some say that he was ambitious. Many did not like how close he was to Mary, especially as a foreigner and a Catholic. They felt that he controlled access to her, so some people had an issue with his position. Initially, Rizzio was also a close ally of Darnley, Mary's husband. After the Darnley marriage, though, rumors really swirled that Rizzio and Mary were having an affair, that they were lovers. There were accounts of Darnley finding Rizzio in the Queen's bedchamber in the middle of the night, or the door was barred to Darnley, which really angered him. But at the same time, some accounts were similar when they're talking about Rizzio and Darnley as well. So we have to take it all with a grain of salt. Really, Darnley just became increasingly jealous and he vowed revenge. And the Protestant lords saw this as an opportunity. Even though Darnley is Catholic, they see this as an opportunity. So in March 1566, Darnley entered into a secret conspiracy with the Protestant lords and aided in this plot to kill Rizzio. So at 8 o'clock on Saturday, March 9th, 1566, Mary, Rizzio, and a few others were seated for supper in the Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, and rebels burst into the supper room, demanded that Rizzio be handed over. Mary refused. The accounts say that Rizzio was hiding behind her, but he was eventually seized. Now, at this time, too, Mary is 6 months pregnant, and some accounts mention one of the lords pointing a gun at her belly, demanding that she release Rizzio. There were rumors at the time that she was pregnant with Rizzio's child, and those were rumors. Sadly, Rizzio was stabbed 57 times in front of the Queen and thrown down the staircase. And of course, this was just horrendous and traumatic for Mary. Actually, the location of Rizzio's murder is marked with a plaque today at Holyrood, and underneath is purportedly a red mark on the floorboards, which was supposedly left when Rizzio was stabbed to death. So if you're in Edinburgh and you can go to the Holyrood House, you'll be able to see this. So needless to say, Mary was just beside herself. In the aftermath, Darnley kind of comes to his senses, and he and Mary decide to flee for temporary refuge, and they stayed at Dunbar Castle for a week before they returned to Edinburgh. I don't really know why. This is something that I will need to dig into, but the formal rebel lords, including Murray, her half-brother, they were restored to council, and Mary had Darnley declared innocent of the murder. So, I'm speculating here, but I think that this is her trying to kind of keep the peace a little bit, and she doesn't want to instigate something. But this incident further exacerbated the marital problems between Mary and Darnley. Things just were not good. However, just 3 months later, Prince James was born, June 19th, 1566, in Edinburgh Castle. Here's the bedchamber where he was born. And actually, if you go to Edinburgh Castle today, it looks a lot like this still. So that's pretty cool to see. So at this time, Mary's rule of Scotland has become pretty unstable. She and Darnley, as Catholics, faced opposition from the Protestant leaders, who Darnley secretly aligned with for the Rizzio murder. Her marriage was just continuing to crumble. In spite of it all, James was baptized in the Catholic Church. There was a great celebration that was held at Stirling Castle in December of 1566. There was much pomp and circumstance, pageantry, feasting, and so this baptismal fete was really portraying a very confident monarch, showing a strong Stuart dynasty. And this was as much a message for Scotland as it was for England. Historian Michael Lynch put it this way. I like how he explains it. For Scotland, the triumph, this celebration was a visible demonstration of the peace promised after religious and civil disturbance, guaranteed by the power which it suggested lay in the House of Stuart. It was also a pointed demonstration to England that of the two queens, Scotland's must in 1566 have seemed more secure. As we know, James had a clear path to English succession, and spoiler alert, he would eventually unite the kingdoms under one crown in 1603. But at this point in time, Elizabeth is still unmarried and childless. But shortly before James's baptism celebrations, Mary held a meeting with the leading nobility to discuss the problem of Darnley. Divorce was discussed. Likely other options for his removal were too. Um, they decided it was prudent to protect the Commonwealth from a young fool and a proud tyrant. So Darnley was really becoming an issue, which leads us to our next controversy. Darnley must have read the writing on the wall, so he ended up laying low at his father's estates in Glasgow. But in January 1567, Mary convinced him to return to Edinburgh and recruit from some of his illnesses that he was trying to get through. So she had him stay at the former abbey of Kirklefield. In the early morning hours of February 10th, 1567, two or three explosions occurred at Kirklefield, and Darnley was found dead, smothered with another man. So this image, contemporary image, so it was done at this time period, depicts the event. You can see we've got a couple of men here, so presumably Darnley and the other man. We got some burials, and I don't know everything else that's happening here, but this is how people depicted the event. These explosions were later attributed to two barrels of gunpowder that were placed underneath Darnley's sleeping quarters. So that looks pretty suspicious, and the rest of the world thought so. So, in fact, Elizabeth ends up writing to Mary about this and warns her cousin about what all the world is thinking, i.e., that Mary had him killed. That was the assumption. We have another character to introduce. The Earl of Bothwell was believed to be guilty. He was a close advisor to Mary, and he was tried before a parliament but acquitted due to lack of evidence. A week later, after Bothwell was acquitted, he had convinced more than 24 lords and bishops to sign a bond in which they agreed to support his aim to marry Mary. So this is not a good look for Mary. This is not looking good. The rest of the world doesn't think so. And speculation and conspiracies are flying. Excuse me. So who was this Earl of Bothwell? He's another important character. James Hepburn was born in Edinburgh, and he supported Mary Guise's regency, Mary's mother, and opposed the Protestant lords of the congregation. He often openly quarreled with the Protestant lords, especially the Earl of Arran, right? Remember, we've talked about him, who accused Bothwell of plotting to kidnap Mary in 1562. So just file that away. Bothwell met Mary in the French royal court in 1560, and they became close over the years. After his acquittal for Darnley's murder and support from the nobility and the clergy to marry Mary, it is alleged that he essentially abducted Mary and convinced her that Edinburgh was not safe for her. So she accompanied him to his castle at Dunbar. She was, for all intents and purposes, taken prisoner by Bothwell, and she was allegedly raped by him to secure a marriage. These accounts still remain a controversial issue. Historians can't seem to agree on whether Mary was an accomplice in all of this or whether she was an unwilling victim. So there's still a consensus to be made there. But in any case, they were married on May 5th, 15th, 1567 at Holyrood in Edinburgh, which was only a week after Bothwell divorced his second wife. So again, that also looks suspicious. And needless to say, this was also a very tumultuous marriage and a very short marriage. Um, this marriage deeply divided the country. It was unpopular between Catholics and Protestants alike. For Catholics, they did not consider the marriage lawful because of Bothwell's divorce, and they did not consider the service valid. And at the end of the day, everyone was really just shocked that Mary would marry the man accused of murdering her husband. So, 26 Scottish peers who styled themselves as the Confederate Lords, they raised an army against Mary and Bothwell to protest. And this resulted in a skirmish between the opposing sides at Carberry Hill on June 15th, 1567, only a month after they were married. In this skirmish, Bothwell manages to escape. He eventually makes his way to Denmark, and years later, he essentially dies in prison without any titles. But Mary surrendered. She was taken back to Edinburgh, where she was denounced as an adulteress and a murderer, and she was promptly imprisoned. So this is a lot. This is a lot that has happened between 1565 and 1567 in Mary's life. So now she is imprisoned by the rebel forces, and they have put her in Loch Leven Castle on an island in the middle of Loch Leven, which you can see right here. This is where she was imprisoned. Kind of hard to escape from there. Unfortunately, while she was there, she miscarried twins, and those were believed to be Bothwell's. But she remained in prison here while her supporters continued to fight a civil war. And that civil war would last until 1573. So on July 24th, 1567, while she's imprisoned, Mary was forced to abdicate the throne. And so her 1-year-old son, James, became king. Now, because he's a baby king, he needs a regent. And the person that they give the regency to is Mary's half-brother, the Earl of Moray, who we've talked about, also James Stuart. So little baby James becomes King James VI, and his uncle becomes regent in his stead. So now we've got a Protestant leader in place. Mary does actually escape Loch Leven. She's aided by the castle's owner, and that was in May 1568, so about a year later after her abdication. She actually managed to raise an army of about 6,000 men, and those forces met Moray's forces, her half-brother, at Langside on May 13th, 1568. It was here that Mary was defeated, and she ended up fleeing south to seek asylum in England from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. Okay, that was a lot. And we still have one more section to go. So here's a Harry Coup break. I like to introduce these when we get to a point in any lecture where it's like, I just need to breathe, and there's a lot going on. So enjoy this picture of a cute little Harry Coup at the sunshine and the grass, reminding us all that it's good to get outside and touch grass and enjoy the sun. And so we'll move on in just a second. So just to recap, Mary has just been through so much. Um, Bad marriages, civil war, she's imprisoned, and now she's leaving Scotland. And so she was only in Scotland for 6 years, 1561 until 67. And this brings us on to part 3, the final unfortunate chapters of the Marian story. This is really her exile and execution, 1567 to 1587. So Mary fled south to England, and she really expected Elizabeth to help her regain her throne in Scotland. Here's Elizabeth in all her glory, and here's Mary. After all, they were cousins and queens, two women who were running kingdoms on the same island. So Elizabeth would surely help Mary, right? That was her thought. But Elizabeth was extremely cautious and decided to do her own due diligence. Um, she was having a hard time wrestling with, whether or not Mary was guilty in murdering her husband and all kinds of things. And Elizabeth had grown increasingly paranoid as she had not married or had an heir yet. So Mary did stay in England, but she was in captivity. Elizabeth kept a close eye on her and eventually ordered an inquiry into the circumstances surrounding Darnley's death to determine Mary's guilt. This trial, which was called the Inquiry of York, took place between October 1568 and mid 1569. And it said that Mary refused to attend or even acknowledge that any court had the power to try her. During Mary's time in England, she was imprisoned in many castles. So, the one that's depicted here is Tutbury Castle. She spent most of her time here, the better part of 16 years, between 1569 and 1585. Um, and I mean, for all of us looking at this, doesn't seem like a bad place to be imprisoned. She was actually allowed to have her own domestic staff. She had about 16 staff members. She had private chefs. She had the choice of 32 dishes that were still served to her on silver plates. She was allowed to go outside under strict supervision. Um, but in reality, she didn't have any freedom. And that was hard on her, as it would be for anybody. She spent the majority of her time embroidering. There are many surviving embroideries by Mary during this period, but one of the most famous and honestly intriguing, I really like this one, is of a cat and a mouse. So you can see here it says a cat. We have an orange cat and we have a mouse. She often embroidered cats, but in this particular case, the cat is interpreted as representing Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, perhaps, as the mouse. She was feeling like she was trapped. So, this is kind of the downfall of Mary were various plots and scandals while she was imprisoned in England. Mary was increasingly seen as a threat to Elizabeth's rule. Perhaps she was the cat and Mary was the mouse. But these eventually sealed Mary's fate. So we'll go through some of the notable ones. Um, these so-called plots against Elizabeth stemmed from Catholic support to depose Elizabeth and restore Catholicism through Mary. So, in the Inquiry of York, which I briefly just mentioned, um, that relied upon the so-called casket letters, this first one here, as evidence against Mary to determine her guilt in Darnley's murder. So, um, uh, it comprised eight unsigned love letters, purportedly from Mary to Bothwell, two marriage contracts, and a love sonnet, and they were all found in a silver gilt casket. If they could show that Mary was having an affair with Bothwell while she was married to Darnley, and perhaps she was an accomplice in the murder of Darnley, then that would seal a conviction. And that would also remove Mary as a threat to the English crown. Mary, of course, denied writing them and claimed they were forgeries. And I really want to point out here that this is a source of so much controversy amongst historians. It is really hard to authenticate some of these things. So the inquiry concluded with Elizabeth's verdict that nothing was proven against Mary or the Lords, but she still had to be careful. Elizabeth did not want to convict or acquit Mary of murder, so Mary remained in custody in England, and Moray, her half-brother, was allowed to go back to Scotland as regent. So Elizabeth is really treading a fine line here. One decision or another could have dire consequences. So, after the Inquiry of York and the casket letters, a series of plots kind of came to the fore. And again, it's important to note that it's difficult to determine if these were legitimate or not. We had the Ridolfi plot in 1571, and then another famous one, the Throckmorton plot in 1583. And Again, these all stemmed from a desire to depose Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Because of their fear, the English Parliament around 1584 proposed a series of legislative actions that sanctioned the killing of anyone who plotted against Elizabeth. So they're giving themselves a legal authority if there are any more plots that can be punishable by death. They also forbade any communication going to Mary or from Mary. So no one's allowed to communicate with Mary. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a second. But also in the same year, in desperation for freedom, I mean, by this point, it's been almost 20 years since she's been in captivity in England. Mary proposed an association with her son James, who is king. She proposed that she could jointly rule with her son, which would sort of act as guardrails because he was Protestant. And so if she were to rule with her son jointly, maybe that would make Elizabeth feel a little bit better because, he's Protestant and he would keep her kind of in line. And she really, her condition, she just wanted to be released. But to her dismay, James, her son, rejected the proposal and signed an alliance with Elizabeth instead. And so Elizabeth also rejected this proposal because she had become very paranoid of Mary's claim to the throne and honestly didn't trust her. So this left Mary, rightfully so, brokenhearted and very vulnerable. So this leads up to the straw that broke the camel's back, the Babington Plot, which happened in 1586. The long-term goal of this plot was the invasion of England by Spain and France to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, restoring the old religion, Catholicism. The chief conspirators were Anthony Babington and John Ballard, a Jesuit priest. It involved ciphered letters, which were placed into a beer barrel cork, and there was a certain way of getting those letters in and out and deciphering them. But the interesting thing to note, and as I mentioned, communication was not allowed in or out to or from Mary. But Elizabeth's close advisors understood that without some communication, they would not be able to determine if Mary was involved in some of these plots. So Walsingham, who was a close advisor to Elizabeth, set up a communication system for Mary, really in an attempt to entrap her. And that's what I was talking about earlier with the ciphers and the beer barrel corks. So Mary thought her letters were secure, but Walsingham intercepted and read every single one. The letters allege that Mary ordered the great plot to commence, which, i.e., would be Elizabeth's assassination. So on August 11th, 1586, she was arrested and trial began. Mary denied all of these charges. She protested that she had been denied the opportunity to review evidence. Her papers were removed from her. She was denied access to legal counsel. And then she also argued that as a foreign queen, she was never an English subject to begin with and could not be convicted of treason. But that didn't matter. She was convicted on October 25th, 1586. Now, it's interesting to note that Elizabeth hesitated to order her execution, even though the English Parliament was really pressuring her. She was concerned that it could set off a series of consequences or retaliation from either Catholic powers or even James, Mary's son, even though he had an alliance with Elizabeth. So it took a few months, but on February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. And Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed February 8th, 1857, at 44 years old. She was reported to spend the last hours of her life in prayer and also managing her affairs. Um, Under her outer garments, she wore crimson brown, which you can kind of see here, which was the liturgical color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church. Her last words were in Latin: "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Some unsavory aspects of this execution, which I think sometimes has been brought about in pop culture. As we know, she was not beheaded with a single strike. So typically it would just be one foul swoop, but unfortunately, the first blow missed her neck and struck her on the back of the head. And it took a couple of tries for them to actually get it. Um, the executioner eventually did the deed, and as accounts go, he picked up her head, said, "God save the Queen," but unfortunately, he was holding a wig, and Mary's head fell to the ground. So, not the best way to go out, especially for a queen. Elizabeth was not there. Upon hearing of Mary's execution, she was purportedly upset, claiming that they moved forward without her approval. In reality, she just wanted to distance herself from the execution and wanted to maintain plausible deniability. So, at the end of the story, there cannot be two queens on the same island. Mary's story continues to intrigue and vex us all. Mary is buried in a tomb, which was erected by her son in Westminster Abbey, and I think that was done in 1615 or 1616. And so that was well after her son James had also become King of England. So we've come to the end of the lecture. What was Mary's legacy? Was she a true politic ruler with great ambition for the English crown? Was she young and naive, unable to navigate a country's politics that were unfamiliar to her in a time of civil and religious unrest? Was she simply influenced by all the characters around her, like Darnley and Bothwell? Was she set up and executed simply because of Elizabeth's paranoia, or did she actually participate in those plots to depose Elizabeth? Or was she a true Catholic martyr? Historians continue to wrestle with these questions, and as we all study Mary, it would be interesting, and I'd be curious to hear everyone's thoughts after they give this more of a study. Um, so at the end of the lecture, I like to give a few resources. If you're into podcasts, The Rest is History is a great podcast. They have a six-part series on Mary, Queen of Scots that came out this summer. Highly recommend it. And we can dive into some details there. And again, this lecture, we really covered a lot in a short amount of time. And so there's so much more that you can dive into on your own. Another podcast that I found, I actually haven't listened to it, but it looked pretty interesting, was called Not Just the Tudors, and they have a couple of episodes on Mary. If you're more of a reader and you like reading history, any of these historians would be a great read. John Guy is really well known for his coverage of the Tudors and the Stuarts, and Antonia Fraser, Jenny Warmald, and Alison Ware. Jenny Warmald is known for having a very cynical view of Mary Queen of Scots. Her book is called Mary Queen of Scots: A Study in Failure. So she really just believes that Mary had no idea what she was doing and was just a failure on all fronts. So it is interesting to see the differences. But across the board, if you combine it all together, you get a pretty good view of maybe what Mary was like and her motivations. If you prefer historical fiction, Margaret George has a great book. It's a big book on Mary, Queen of Scots. That's also good. And if you like none of those things, or if you like all of those things and you also like movies, the 2018 film Mary Queen of Scots is the most recent and is pretty good. Obviously, there's a lot of embellishment. There are historical inaccuracies, and there are things in it that that didn't happen, and then there are things in it that they or there are things that they just didn't put in there that did happen. But it's an interesting movie, and I think it's well done. There's a couple other ones. I haven't watched this one. This is more of a young adult TV series um, on Mary Queen of Scots, so that's probably going to have a lot of creative liberties. But just some options for you. So, with that said, um, thanks for joining me. I hope you learned a little bit after spending your afternoon talking about a fascinating piece of Scottish history. If there are any questions, we can ask them now. You can also email me at kira.johnson@coloradoscots.org. So that's KIRA.JOHNSON@coloradoscots.org, and I'd be happy to discuss with you, or if you have any ideas of what you want to dive into next. I do want to mention that our next lecture is slotted in February. I don't remember the exact date. Samantha can, maybe you can remind me when you pop back on. And that's going to be on Jacobite Scotland. So really, we're kind of moving in a chronological way, which will make a lot of sense. So another really interesting and tumultuous period. So thanks so much.
Yeah, so that next lecture, Jacobite Scotland, will be February 7th, and that will be in person at Scottish Stained Glass, I believe at 2 p.m. on that day as well.
Great.
So if you guys are interested in that, make sure you RSVP on our website. I'm going to stop recording and we'll open up the mics for questions if you guys have any.
Sweet. Thanks, Samantha. And I'll do my best to answer them. And if I can't, uh, give me your email or something, and